The champagne flute in my hand was cold enough to burn, but I didn't flinch, not when the crystal chandeliers overhead threw knife-edged shadows across the Met Gala's marble floors, not when the orchestra's strings soared through the humid air like a threat, and certainly not when Jason Holloway, my fiancé, the man whose ring I wore, raised his glass to toast me in front of 300 of New York's most vicious socialites. This is where I'm supposed to smile, I thought. So I did. His voice carried, smooth as the bourbon he'd been gulping all night. To Emily, he said, pausing, just long enough for the room to lean in. My beautiful, ambitious... Another pause. The crowd tittered. My fingers tightened around the stem of my glass. Gold-digging social climber. Laughter erupted like shattering glass. Cameras flashed. I could see the headlines already. Holloway heir exposes fraudulent fiancé. The woman beside me, some heiress in a dress worth more than my Ivy League tuition, snorted into her wine. I didn't blink. Instead, I took a slow sip of my champagne, letting the bubbles dissolve on my tongue like poison. Jason was still grinning, drunk on his own cruelty. Kidding, babe, he slurred, reaching to sling an arm around my waist. I sidestepped him. The room held its breath. Look at them, I thought. The men in their bespoke tuxedos, the women with diamonds sharp enough to draw blood. They'd all known. Of course they had. Jason had probably rehearsed this little performance at his gentleman's club, basking in their laughter as he described how hilarious it would be to humiliate me in front of the only world that mattered to him. I could have cried. I could have screamed. But what would that have gotten me? A blurry photo in page 6. A hashtag, #DesperateGoldDigger. Another check from the Holloways to keep my mouth shut. No. So I smiled wider. Darling, I said, loud enough for the nearest reporters to hear, if I wanted your money, I'd have picked a family that still had some. The crowd's laughter died mid-breath. Jason's face went slack. I didn't wait for his reply. I turned on my heel, let them all see how steady my hands were, and walked straight to the bar. Ordered another drink. Memorized every smirking face. By the time Jason stumbled after me, sputtering apologies, I'd already made my decision. You want a villain, Jason, I thought, clinking my glass against his, in mock reconciliation. I'll give you a masterpiece. The game was on. The morning after the Met Gala, I woke up to 300 missed calls and a single orchid on my doorstep. White, pristine, and utterly meaningless. Jason's signature move. The Holloway family florist must have worked overtime. I crushed the petals under my heel on my way to check the mail, where a cream-coloured envelope with the Holloway crest gleamed like a fresh wound. Inside was a cheque for $500,000. For your discretion, the note read in handwriting so perfect it had to be his mother's. No signature, no apology, just a price tag slapped on my silence, like I was some mistress they could pay off after a scandal. The paper smelled like jasmine and old money. I held it over the stove and watched the flames lick at the numbers until they curled into black ash. By noon, the headlines were everywhere. Holloway heir's gala blunder. Drunken joke or truth revealed. The media couldn't decide whether to paint me as a victim or a fraud, so they hedged their bets. My Instagram flooded with bots calling me a mercenary bitch and DMs from women I'd never met, saying, "Get your bag, queen." None of them mattered. What mattered was the voicemail from Jason's PR team, oozing faux concern. Emily, let's spin this as a misunderstanding. We'll draft a statement. You'll look gracious. Jason will look contrite. I deleted it before they finished. I spent that afternoon in my apartment with the blinds drawn, scrolling through every Holloway Industries press release from the last decade. That's when I found him. Charles Holloway, Jason's estranged father. The man had vanished from society photos 6 years ago after a messy divorce, but the financials told a different story. He still controlled 51% of the voting shares. Still had the power to cut Jason off with a single signature. The tabloids called Charles a reclusive tycoon. I called him an opportunity. That night, I dressed in a black sheath dress, no jewellery, no obvious labels, and took a car to the Carlisle. The concierge didn't blink when I asked for Charles's table. "He dines alone every Thursday," she murmured as if sharing a secret. I saw him before he saw me, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s, reading The Economist with a tumbler of whiskey at his elbow. No bodyguards, no entourage, just a billionaire who'd rather eat alone than suffer fools. I slid into the chair across from him without waiting for an invitation. "Mr. Holloway," I said, ignoring his raised eyebrow. "Let's talk about your son." His glass paused halfway to his lips. For the first time in 24 hours, I felt the knot in my chest loosen. The game had just begun. The silence at Charles Holloway's table stretched for 3 full seconds. Just long enough to be uncomfortable, just short enough to be polite. His whiskey hovered mid-air, the ice cubes clinking softly like a warning. I didn't flinch. "Most people," he finally said, setting down his glass with deliberate calm, "would lead with an apology for interrupting a private dinner." I tilted my head, letting my hair fall just so across one shoulder. "Most people," I countered, "would have stopped their son from publicly humiliating his fiancée at the Met Gala." A muscle twitched near his jawline. Bingo. Charles gestured for the waiter to bring another glass. When the crystal tumbler appeared before me, he poured 2 fingers of his 25-year Macallan without asking my preference. A test. I took a sip, letting the smoky burn coat my tongue before speaking. "You've been buying up contemporary Latin American art," I said casually, nodding toward the Sotheby's catalogue peeking from his briefcase. "But you always stop bidding right before the pieces break 6 figures. His eyes sharpened. "You follow auction trends." "I follow everything." Reaching into my clutch, I slid across a folded printout, his son's trust fund disbursements for the past 5 years. "Jason spends more on vintage sports cars than you do on your entire collection." Charles didn't touch the paper. He didn't need to. The tightening around his eyes told me everything. The waiter returned with bread service. I selected a rosemary focaccia square, tearing off a precise corner. "The Guerrero triptych you lost last month?" The underbidder was a shell company registered to your ex-wife's decorator. This time, his laugh was genuine, a low, surprised rumble. "You're either very thorough or very dangerous." "Both." I dabbed my lips with the linen napkin. "But mostly, Mr. Holloway, I am very patient." He leaned back, studying me with new interest. "What exactly are you proposing?" I smiled then, slow and deliberate, the way I'd practiced in the mirror that morning. "Not a proposal, an observation. You've spent years distancing yourself from Jason's indiscretions, but reputation is like art. Sometimes it needs the right curator." When the check came, Charles reached for it automatically. I placed my hand over the leather folio. "Allow me." Dropping 3 crisp hundreds on the table, exact change, including tip, I stood to leave. "Emily," his voice stopped me at the restaurant's threshold. "I'm hosting a small gathering at my penthouse next Thursday. Some collectors, a few critics. You should come." I didn't turn around. "I'll consider it." The elevator doors closed on his intrigued expression. In the mirrored walls, my reflection smiled back at me, triumphant. Game, set, match. Rain lashed against the penthouse windows as I adjusted the neckline of my emerald green dress, the exact shade of the Holloway family jewels. Charles had insisted on hosting his art collector's dinner tonight, despite the weather advisory. I suspected he enjoyed watching lesser mortals navigate flooded streets to bask in his presence. The doorbell rang precisely at 8. Not the main entrance, the private elevator. Charles stood there holding 2 things, a bottle of 1945 Chateau Mouton Rothschild and what looked suspiciously like a jewellery box. "You're early," I observed, stepping aside to let him in. "So are you." His gaze swept over the apartment, the Monet reproduction I'd accidentally left on the easel, the leather-bound volume of Neruda poems dog-eared to his favourite verse. "I see you've made yourself at home." I took the wine from his hands, letting our fingers brush just long enough to be deliberate. Someone had to test the acoustics before your guests arrive. "Your Vermeer echo is atrocious in here." Charles chuckled, loosening his tie. "There is no Vermeer." "Not yet." I poured the wine, watching the ruby liquid catch the light. "But there will be when I'm done advising you." He studied me over the rim of his glass. 6 weeks of carefully orchestrated encounters, gallery openings, late-night museum tours, chance meetings at his favourite cigar bar had led to this moment. I could see the calculation in his eyes, the same one I'd seen in Jason's when he'd sized up a business deal. The storm outside intensified, thunder rattling the floor-to-ceiling windows. Charles set down his glass with deliberate precision. "Let's skip the performance tonight," he said. "I have a proposition for you." I arched an eyebrow. "I'm listening." He produced the velvet box, flipping it open to reveal a ring I recognised immediately, the Holloway emerald last worn by his ex-wife at their divorce proceedings. "Marry me?" Not a question, a statement. I made a show of examining the stone, tilting it toward the light. "This is 3 carats smaller than Jason offered, and worth 300 times more." Charles stepped closer, his cologne, vetiver, and something ruthlessly expensive, filling the space between us. "You'll have full access to the collections, discretionary funds, and," he added with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "the ability to veto any trust fund disbursements." I pretended to consider, tracing the edge of the jewellery box. "What about prenups?" "Airtight. You'll walk away comfortable." His gaze sharpened, but not with the company. Lightning flashed, illuminating the predatory gleam in his expression. He thought this was his move, a wealthy, older man securing a brilliant trophy wife on favourable terms. I slid the ring onto my finger. It fit perfectly. "Darling," I purred, kissing his cheek, "you forget. I don't want your company." I let my lips brush his ear. "I just want your son to watch me wear his mother's jewellery to breakfast every damn day." Charles threw back his head and laughed, a rich, booming sound that shook the crystal stemware. When he pulled back, his eyes held something new. Respect. "Welcome to the family," he murmured. Outside, the storm reached its crescendo. Somewhere across town, Jason Holloway was about to get the phone call that would shatter his world. And I couldn't wait to watch. I stood at the altar in a custom Vivienne Westwood gown, ivory silk with a corset bodice tight enough to remind everyone I didn't need Holloway money to stop breathing. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same society pages that had crucified me months ago now gushed over my storybook romance with Charles. The guest list was a who's who of people who'd laughed at me that night at the Met, all now tripping over themselves to kiss my ring. Literally. Charles squeezed my hand as the organist launched into Pachelbel's canon. His palm was warm, dry, the hands of a man who'd spent decades signing contracts that ruined lives without breaking a sweat. I squeezed back, my nails leaving crescent moons in his skin. Then the doors burst open. Jason stood silhouetted in the afternoon sun, his tuxedo wrinkled, his hair a mess. He looked like he'd been drinking since dawn. The collective gasp from the pews was almost comical. "Dad!" he choked out, taking a stumbling step forward. "You can't do this." The priest froze mid-sentence. Charles didn't even turn around. I did. Slowly, deliberately, I lifted my veil, the same Belgian lace his mother had worn in 1987, and met Jason's bloodshot eyes. "Darling," I cooed, loud enough for the front row of vultures to hear, "you're late. Again." The guest tittered. Jason's face purpled. He lunged up the aisle, but Charles merely raised 2 fingers. Security materialized, dragging him back as he screamed about prenups and gold diggers and, most creatively, how I'd brainwashed his father. Charles finally turned then, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. Disinherit him. The lawyer materialized with a document I drafted myself. Charles scrawled his signature without reading it. Jason's trust fund evaporated in the time it took the ink to dry. The organist, bless her, started playing again. I turned back to the altar, my skirts whispering against the marble. The priest's hands shook as he pronounced us man and wife. When Charles kissed me, his lips tasted like victory and single malt scotch. The reception was a masterclass in cruelty. I made sure Jason's place card sat directly across from ours at the head table. He had to watch as Charles fed me cake with his grandmother's silver fork, as we danced to At Last under the same chandelier where Jason had taken his first steps. When the photographer posed us for family photos, I beckoned Jason forward. "Come, sweetheart," I murmured, stroking the emerald at my throat, his mother's favourite necklace. "Let's make this official." The shutter clicked just as he vomited into a $15,000 floral arrangement. Later, when the last of the champagne had been spilled and the gossip columnists had slunk away with their scoops, Charles pressed a key into my palm, the master to his penthouse. "Our flight to Paris leaves at dawn," he murmured. I smiled, running my thumb over the cold metal. Somewhere in this city, Jason was sobbing into his fifth martini. And the best part? This was only the beginning. The suite at the Ritz Paris smelled like tuberose and impending death. Charles had insisted on ordering room service. Foie gras, truffle risotto, a bottle of 82 Petrus that cost more than my first car. He'd barely touched his plate before excusing himself to the bedroom, complaining of chest pains. I'd watched him shuffle away, his normally impeccable posture bent like a question mark, and waited exactly 17 minutes before checking on him. The scene was almost poetic. Charles Holloway, the man who'd built an empire on broken promises, sprawled across 800 thread-count sheets with his tie undone and his face the colour of spoiled pâté. His breathing came in wet, ragged gasps. "Emily," he rasped, one trembling hand reaching for the bedside phone. I crossed the room in 3 silent strides and placed my palm over his. "Shh," I murmured, stroking his wedding band with my thumb. "The doctor's on his way." His eyes widened. We both knew I hadn't called anyone. Outside, the Eiffel Tower glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, indifferent to the drama unfolding in Suite 312. I perched on the edge of the bed and smoothed Charles's hair back from his damp forehead, humming along to the jazz floating up from the hotel bar. His pulse thrummed under my fingers, frantic as a trapped bird. "Don't! Fight it!" he wheezed, suddenly lucid. His grip tightened on my wrist. "You planned this." I leaned down until my lips brushed his ear. "No, darling," I whispered. "But I certainly didn't prevent it." His final breath left him in a shuddering sigh. I counted to 60 before reaching for the phone. By the time the paramedics arrived, I had arranged myself artfully on the chaise lounge, still in my black La Perla negligée, a single tear tracking through my perfectly applied makeup. The hotel manager hovered nervously as the medical team confirmed what we all could see. Charles Holloway was dead. Heart failure. Tragic. Unexpected. "Madam," the doctor began gently, "is there someone we should call?" I let my lower lip tremble just so. Just my stepson. The reading of the will took place in a wood-panelled office that smelled of lemon oil and quiet desperation. Jason arrived reeking of airport whiskey, his eyes bloodshot. He barely glanced at me, until the lawyer cleared his throat. "To my beloved wife Emily," the attorney read, his voice carefully neutral, "I leave controlling interest in Holloway Holdings, the penthouse at 740 Park Avenue, and sole discretion over the Jason Holloway Family Trust disbursements, Jason's chair screeched as he launched to his feet. That's impossible, I silenced him with a raised hand, the emerald on my finger catching the light. Sit down. For the first time in his life, Jason Holloway obeyed. The lawyer continued, detailing the rest of Charles' meticulous bequests. The art collection to the Met, the summer home to his alma mater, $1 to his ex-wife. With each clause, Jason's shoulders hunched further. When the room finally emptied, Jason cornered me by the elevators. You bitch, he hissed. You knew this would happen. I adjusted one pearl earring, his grandmother's naturally, and smiled. Knew, I repeated, pressing the down button. No, hoped. The elevator doors slid open. Wow, that would be telling. As the car descended, I caught my reflection in the polished brass. The widow, Holloway, young, beautiful, ruthless, and just getting started. The penthouse intercom buzzed at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday. I knew it was him before I even checked the security feed. No one else would dare show up unannounced at that hour, smelling like bargain bin gin and bad decisions. On the monitor, Jason's face loomed in distorted fisheye, his usually perfect hair greasy, his designer stubble edging into hobo territory. He'd worn the same Tom Ford suit from the funeral, now wrinkled beyond salvation. I pressed the talk button. The banks aren't open yet, darling. His breath fogged up the camera. Emily, please. That single word, please, was sweeter than the first sip of Charles's vintage Bordeaux collection. I made him wait 11 full minutes before buzzing him up. The elevator doors opened to reveal Jason swaying slightly on his feet, his knuckles white around a manila envelope. The Holloway emerald caught the light as I crossed my arms, letting him take in the scene, me in Charles's monogrammed silk robe, barefoot on the marble floors he'd played on as a child. He licked his cracked lips. We need to talk. Talk? I gestured to the envelope. Or beg? Jason flinched but rallied, thrusting the papers at me. I've got an offer from Vantage Capital. They'll buy my shares at a 30% premium if you release the voting rights. I didn't bother looking at the documents. Instead, I walked to the wet bar and poured 2 fingers of Charles's favourite Macallan, the same bottle Jason had coveted for years. Let me guess, I said, swirling the amber liquid. You're down to your last Rolex, the Bentley's been repossessed, and your friends at Cipriani won't even comp your martinis anymore. His jaw tightened. This isn't a joke. Neither is the clause in your father's will that prevents you from selling a single share without my approval. I took a slow sip. But, by all means, explain how this ends well for you. Jason's facade cracked then. He lunged forward, gripping the edge of the bar until his tendons stood out like wires. What do you want? An apology? Fine. I'm sorry I called you a gold digger. I'm sorry I... Wrong question. I set down my glass with a deliberate click. The real question is, what are you willing to do? Silence. The grandfather clock in the foyer ticked off 7 seconds before he exhaled sharply. Name it. I smiled and reached into the robe's pocket, producing a single sheet of paper. First, you'll sign this confession about the Met Gala, how you planned the humiliation in advance with your frat brothers. Full details. He scanned the document, face paling. This would go viral in seconds, I agreed cheerfully. Second, you'll do a tell-all interview with Vanity Fair about your family's tax evasion schemes. On the record. Jason actually staggered back. You're joking. I tilted my head. Do I look like I'm joking? The envelope slipped from his fingers, scattering papers across the floor. For a long moment, he just stared at them, at the life raft he'd so carefully constructed, now sinking under the weight of my conditions. When he finally looked up, his eyes held something new. Raw, unfiltered fear. I twirled the emerald ring around my finger. Tick-tock, Jason. The banks open in 4 hours. Outside, dawn painted the skyline in shades of rose and gold. Somewhere below us, the city was waking up to a new day. Jason Holloway was waking up to his worst nightmare. And I was just getting comfortable. The New York Post hit the stands with a headline written in what could only be described as orgasmic font size. Holloway heir to daddy. I planned it all. I was enjoying poached eggs and a mimosa at Balthazar when the first notifications blew up my phone. By the time my coffee arrived, #Holloway humiliation was trending globally. The accompanying photo, Jason's signed confession complete with drunken frat boy details about his Met Gala prank, looked even better in high resolution. Across the restaurant, a woman at the bar covertly snapped my picture. I raised my glass in salute just as my assistant slid into the opposite booth, her tablet glowing with fresh disaster. "Jason just went live on Morning Show America," she whispered, in tears. I didn't bother looking at the screen. I could imagine it perfectly. Jason's carefully staged vulnerability, the artful shadows under his eyes, the way his voice would crack just so when mentioning his grief-stricken judgment. The Holloways had media training in their DNA. My phone vibrated with an incoming call from Vanity Fair. I sent it to voicemail. "Tell me he's wearing the navy suit," I said, dabbing hollandaise from my lips. My assistant blinked. "How did you—" "It makes his eyes look bluer when he cries." I tossed my napkin aside. "What's his angle?" "Claims you coerced the confession. Says you're emotionally abusive and..." She scrolled nervously. "Allegedly poisoned Charles?" I laughed loud enough to turn heads. "Darling, if I poisoned every man who disappointed me, Manhattan would be a ghost town." The waiter arrived with the check. I paid in cash, always cash now, and left a tip large enough to ensure no one here would ever speak ill of me. Outside, paparazzi swarmed like hungry seagulls. I paused on the sidewalk, letting them get their shots. Emily Holloway, the Black Widow heiress, cool as a razor blade in a Dior trench. One particularly aggressive photographer shoved his lens in my face. "Mrs. Holloway, any comment on Jason's interview?" I adjusted my sunglasses, only that it's fascinating how remorseful he's become. Now that his trust fund's dry, the resulting camera flashes could have powered Times Square. By noon, the news cycle had spiraled into glorious chaos. CNN ran side-by-side comparisons of Jason's confession versus his tearful denials. Twitter erupted with memes of his most hypocritical soundbites. And, Page 6 uncovered his Venmo history. $10,000 payments to a Misty Daniels, labelled acting lessons. My favourite development, however, came at 3:47 p.m. when the Wall Street Journal dropped their exposé. Holloway heir's secret offshore accounts revealed. I was reviewing blueprints for the Gold Diggers' retreat. Jason's childhood bedroom would make an excellent spa. When my lawyer called. "They're freezing his remaining assets," he said. "IRS just raided his apartment." I traced a finger over the architectural plans. "How tragic." "Emily." My lawyer hesitated. "He's threatening to sue for defamation." I smiled at the construction foreman across my desk and mouthed, "Start demolition tomorrow." Into the phone, I purred, "Let him." The tabloids would eat him alive. And I had a hotel to build. The letter arrived in a plain white envelope, slipped between my morning mail like a razor blade in cotton candy. No return address, just my name written in that looping feminine script I'd seen only once before, on Charles' private line item for El Carlisle. The paper inside smelled like gardenias and trouble. "Meet me at the Oak Room, noon. I know what really happened in Paris." I burned the note in the penthouse fireplace, watching the edges curl to black ash. Of course, Charles had kept a mistress. Of course she'd be the dramatic type. And of course she'd surface now, when Jason's last legal appeals were crumbling like stale biscotti. I arrived 15 minutes late, dressed in head-to-toe Chanel. armor for the coming battle. She sat in Charles's usual corner booth, a willowy redhead with the sharp cheekbones of a woman who'd been beautiful before bitterness carved its lines. A half-finished martini trembled in her manicured hands. "Lillian, I presume?" I said, sliding into the booth without waiting for an invitation. Her smile didn't reach her cold green eyes. "He told me you were sharp." She produced a folded photograph from her clutch. Charles in this very restaurant, mid-laugh, his hand resting atop hers. The date stamp read 3 days before our wedding. I didn't flinch. And yet, he married me. Lillian's perfectly penciled eyebrows arched. "Did he?" She tapped the table twice. A man materialized beside us. Grey suit, nondescript face. The kind of forgettable presence only expensive private investigators cultivate. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, sliding a dossier across the table. "Your husband's autopsy report noticed the irregular bruising pattern on his wrists." I kept my fingers still around my water glass. "Get to the point." Lillian leaned in, her gardenia perfume suddenly cloying. "The police might find it interesting that Charles showed identical bruising after your honeymoon in Saint-Tropez last year." "Ah." So that was her play. I took a slow sip of water, buying time to admire her audacity. She'd done her homework, better than Jason ever had. But she'd made one fatal mistake. She'd assumed I'd panic. Setting down the glass with deliberate calm, I met her gaze. "Tell me, Lillian," I murmured, "how much did Charles pay you to disappear after the Saint-Tropez incident?" Her martini glass slipped, smashing on the floor. Checkmate. The moment Lillian's martini glass shattered, the Oak Room's staff materialized with practiced efficiency, mopping, apologizing, offering replacements. I waved them off, letting the silence stretch until the last busboy retreated. Lillian's composure had cracked like the crystal at her feet. "You're bluffing," she hissed, but her fingers trembled as she fumbled for a cigarette. I reached into my Birkin and slid a single sheet of paper across the table, a bank statement from Charles' Cayman Islands account, dated 2 days after our Saint-Tropez return, a $2 million wire transfer to El Carlisle. Funny, I mused, tracing the numbers with a manicured nail. This looks an awful lot like hush money. The private investigator edged backward, suddenly fascinated by his shoes. Lillian's cigarette snapped between her fingers. "Charles told me everything," she whispered. "How you pressured him into marriage, how I what?" I leaned in, close enough to smell the desperation beneath her perfume. "How I refused to be his dirty little secret like you were. How I actually got the ring." Her slap came fast, but I caught her wrist mid-air, squeezing just enough to make her gasp. The Oak Room's patrons pretended not to notice. "Here's what's going to happen," I said softly, releasing her. "You're going to tell Jason his little conspiracy theory is dead in the water. You're going to delete every photo, every email, every shred of whatever pathetic evidence you think you have." I stood, straightening my cuffs. "And if I ever see you again?" I dropped a business card on the table, the direct line for the SEC whistleblower hotline. Lillian paled. She knew exactly what I'd found in Charles's files. Her husband's insider trading, her daughter's conveniently overlooked college admission scandal. The investigator practically bolted for the door. By the time I reached the lobby, my phone was buzzing with alerts. Jason had just withdrawn his defamation lawsuit. The Daily Mail had exclusively obtained screenshots of Lillian's affair with a tennis pro half her age, and, most deliciously, the IRS had frozen the last of Jason's offshore accounts. I stepped into the golden afternoon light, smiling at the doorman. Somewhere in this city, Jason Holloway was realizing he'd played his final card and lost. Now, time for the knockout punch. The storm hit Manhattan like divine retribution. Horizontal rain, thunder shaking the skyscrapers, taxicabs floating down Broadway like rubber ducks in a bathtub. Perfect weather for a desperate man to make his final move. Jason arrived at the penthouse unannounced, bypassing the doorman with a keycard he shouldn't have possessed. I found him in Charles's study, dripping on the Persian rug, his eyes wild with something beyond anger, beyond pride. This was the look of a drowning man who just spotted a life preserver and realised it was made of lead. "You," he spat, flinging a manila envelope onto the desk, "are going to undo everything." I took my time examining the contents. Grainy security stills from the Ritz Paris hallway, time-stamped the night Charles died. In one frame, a blurry figure in a maid's uniform stood outside our suite. In another, the same figure handed me an envelope. "Clever boy," I murmured. "You actually hired a competent investigator." Jason's laugh was jagged. "That's not a maid. That's Dr. Lefebvre, the cardiologist you coincidentally bumped into at the hotel bar that afternoon." He leaned in, his breath sour with adrenaline. "I know about the digitalis. I know about the forged prescription. And in 24 hours, so will the Paris police." I studied the photos with genuine admiration. He'd done his homework, better than I'd expected. But homework alone doesn't win wars. "Let me guess," I said, pouring 2 fingers of Charles's favourite scotch, the good bottle Jason had always been forbidden to touch. "You want your shares back, your penthouse, your trust fund." I pushed the glass toward him. "All of it." Jason didn't touch the drink. "I want you in prison." Lightning flashed, illuminating the Holloway family portrait behind him. Charles stern, Jason smug at 16, his mother's painted eyes forever watching. I opened my laptop and turned the screen toward him. A live feed showed Lillian Carlisle boarding a flight to Buenos Aires, her face hidden under a floppy hat. "Your star witness." I clicked to the next tab, a wire transfer receipt. She just took a $3 million consulting fee from Holloway Holdings. Jason's fingers twitched toward the photos. "That's bullshit. She wouldn't..." "Wouldn't what? Betray you?" I smiled. "Funny. She said the same thing about Charles." The grandfather clock ticked through 10 seconds of silence before Jason's knees buckled. He caught himself on the desk, his reflection warped in the polished wood. "You can't win," he whispered. I closed the laptop with a soft click. "Darling," I said, plucking the most damning photo from his pile and tearing it neatly in half. "I already have." Outside, the storm raged on. But in here, the war was over. The morning of Jason's final surrender dawned suspiciously bright, the kind of relentless sunshine that exposes every flaw. I chose my outfit carefully, a dove grey Carolina Herrera suit, the colour of mercy, or perhaps gunmetal. He arrived precisely at noon, as summoned, wearing what remained of his pride like a cheap cologne. The penthouse staff had been dismissed, the security cameras conveniently offline. Only the ghosts of the Holloway dynasty watched as Jason Holloway signed away his birthright with a Mont Blanc pen I'd gifted Charles on our first anniversary. "Every share," I reminded him as his hand hovered over the final page. "Every property, every last cent of what might have been yours." His signature bled ink like an open wound. When it was done, I handed him an envelope, the contents of which would buy him a one-way ticket to anywhere but here. He didn't thank me. We both knew this wasn't kindness. The elevator arrived with a cheerful ping. Jason stepped inside, his reflection fractured in the polished brass. For a moment, our eyes met in the warped surface, the boy who'd thought humiliation was a game, and the woman who'd rewritten the rules. "Emily," he said just as the doors began to close. I caught them with one manicured hand. "Yes, darling." His smile was the last bitter dregs of Holloway arrogance. "You'll miss me." The doors slid shut on my laughter. 3 hours later, the press release went out. Jason Holloway resigns all claims to Holloway Holdings. By sunset, the first construction crews arrived at the family estate to begin renovations for the gold diggers' retreat. And at midnight I stood alone in the penthouse, Charles's favourite scotch in hand, watching the city lights blur through the tears I'd promised myself I'd never shed. The intercom buzzed. "Mrs. Holloway," the doorman's voice crackled. "A package for you." The box contained 2 items: Jason's engraved baby rattle from the Holloway vault and a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was unmistakably Charles's, the ink fresh enough to smudge. "I always knew you'd win." I traced the words once, twice, before holding the note over the fireplace. The flames licked hungrily at the edges, turning confession to ash. Outside, the city glittered like a diamond bracelet tossed carelessly across black velvet. Somewhere beyond the skyline, a plane carried Jason toward obscurity. And here I stood, the queen of a kingdom built on vengeance with no one left to fight. I raised my glass to the ghost in the room. To new beginnings. The scotch burned going down. Or maybe that was freedom.